Hey guys, Spud here, as always, and today I am really tired of watching DCS World pilots crash on takeoff. So today we're going over crosswind takeoff techniques in the F-18C Hornet, F-16C Viper, and the F-14A and B Tomcat. Keep in mind, if you fly any other aircraft outside of those three, in DCS, all of these techniques will apply just the same. We of course have to thank Fox 3 Managed Solutions, the best and easiest to use DCS World service out there. Perfect for any size squadron or air wing. Fox 3 makes all of the amazing multiplayer experiences you see on the channel possible. So go check them out and use the discount code pinned in the comment section down below for your first month free. So let's go ahead and hop in the cockpit and get started, guys. Okay guys, here we are in the cockpit of our FA-18. And before we go over the actual technique of how we want to move our controls in our cockpit for our crosswind takeoff, let's go over how to actually find where the wind is coming from in DCS, because it's not really a non-trivial task, unfortunately. I think a lot of what makes this difficult is some holdover from the Russian roots of DCS World, and that the Russians always do things very differently when it comes to the standards of international aviation. So probably the most reliable thing that you can use to find where the wind is coming from in DCS is to simply find the windsock at the end of the runway you're lined up on. So if we look over our right shoulder here, just next to our right vertical stab, we can see the windsock here on runway 34. And we can see that windsock is showing us pretty much a direct crosswind across our runway from right to left. The direction the crosswind is coming from is incredibly important to know to influence the technique of how you're actually going to take off. Now, the actual strength of the wind is not quite as important, but it is still good to know, so that way you can adjust your technique based on how much crosswind you're feeling. So to see the actual numbers of the crosswind in DCS, we want to hit the left Alt and B button on your keyboard to bring up that mission editor generated mission briefing. When you look at the nav wind section, on the ground we can see at ground 7 meters per second, 239 degrees, METEO, whatever that means, to 59 degrees. So the only number here that we care about if we're going from like ICAO standards of how wind should be actually displayed is going to be the 059 degree right here. And 7 meters per second, who knows what that means, but basically I set the wind to be a 15 knot crosswind, pretty much a direct crosswind across the runway. If we look on our HUD here, we can see we're at 340 degrees, and that matches up with the runway heading that we're on at runway 34. So we can go ahead and bring up our HSI to get a better look at where the wind is coming from, and we can see we've got 060 right over here, so that's basically more or less a direct crosswind. So that crosswind is going to be more or less all crosswind component and almost no headwind component, which is the most challenging and difficult crosswind takeoff that you can make. So for the actual technique of the crosswind, we want to open up our controls indicators, that way you guys can get a little bit better view of it. But what we want to do is we want to roll the jet into the wind. So in this case, we want to roll the jet towards that 060 degrees where the wind is coming from. That will really help establish a good directional control as we're going down the runway. We then, of course, want to start using our nose wheel steering just nice and gently to help keep the aircraft centered up on the center line. And then in the FA-18, about 70 to 75 knots of indicated airspeed, we want to click off that nose wheel steering. So that way we're not over controlling the aircraft directionally as we're going down the runway for our takeoff. So let's go ahead and do a little demonstration here of what's going to happen if we don't have any crosswind correction at all. My guess here is we're either going to slam into that truck or that hangar over there, or maybe that hangar over there. So let's go ahead and see what happens. We're just going to push up the throttle here. And you can see on the controls indicator, no crosswind correction at all. And here we go. We're going right off the runway and right into that hangar. Boom. We're dead, and it's a Class A mishap. And that is a whole lot of paperwork for our squadron commander and the Navy as a whole. So let's go ahead and restart. We'll hop back into our FA-18. We'll hop back into our jet here. And some of you guys out there may be thinking, Spud, why does this even happen? Why are you turning into the wind with no crosswind correction, even though the wind is blowing you to the left? Because a lot of people tend to think that a crosswind will blow you with the wind, not into the wind. So it's a little bit confusing. But what's happening here is if we look at the side of our F-18, and this is true of any aircraft in DCS, the wind is grabbing our vertical stabs there and pulling our vertical stabs with the wind, which then creates a yaw movement, which pulls the nose of our jet into the wind. And that's why we went and hit that hangar over there. So now let's do another demonstration showing you guys just how effective rolling into the wind with your ailerons is when it comes to directional control as you're going down the runway. So we're going to roll the jet fully into the wind, full stick deflection. We can see on the controls indicator we're at the stop out there. So let's go ahead and push up the throttles. No other correction is going to be made, but we can see that already is making a huge difference in where we actually departed the runway on that takeoff roll. So massive difference there. So let's go ahead and reset once again. Let's hop back into our F-18. And we will do an actual takeoff this time with our crosswind technique applied to show you guys how much better it is when you have that full crosswind technique applied for your takeoff. Alrighty guys, let's go ahead and go for it. So here we go. We're gonna have that full right stick deflection into the wind. We're gonna hold our brakes, run up our throttles for our static takeoff, release the brakes into burners, nice and gentle corrections with our nose wheel steering turned on. Nose wheel steering's off, larger deflection with our rudders. We're gonna wait a little bit, and now we're gonna start rotating. We're gonna see that right wing dip a little bit. Gears coming up, nice and stable. Flaps are up, and we're gonna ease off on our rudder correction and just let the jet crab into the wind. And we're up. So you guys can see that with proper crosswind takeoff technique, you can take off with a pretty heinous crosswind, no problem in the F-18C Hornet. This is due to the twin rudders on the aircraft, which are definitely a lot smaller than, say, the vertical stabs on a F-16, so the weather vaning effect isn't quite as bad, as well as thanks to the large wheelbase of the F-18, it is very directionally stable, which is definitely a hallmark of carrier-based aircraft like the F-18 and F-14 Tomcat. So it is definitely possible, guys, and I recommend that you guys try it. You're gonna crash a whole bunch of times because you just simply can't feel what is happening with the aircraft in the simulator. You just have to rely on what you're seeing, as well as if you've never flown an airplane in real life and you never felt what crosswind feels like, it's definitely a very alien thing to think about making all those different control movements as you're rocketing down the runway. It can be very overwhelming. So just give it lots of practice, give it lots of time, and you guys will definitely get there. Let's hop over to the F-16C Viper and take a look. Alright guys, welcome to the office of the F-16C Viper. And unfortunately in the F-16 there's a couple of things that are working against us to make a crosswind takeoff even more difficult than an F-18C Hornet. If we go to the F2 view, we can see that our vertical stabilizer is a lot bigger area-wise as compared to the F-18 in relation to the total area of the side of our aircraft. This is a lot more area for the wind to grab and weather vane us into the wind. Another thing that's making crosswind takeoffs more difficult in the F-16 is the very short span between the main wheels of the aircraft. This is a contributing factor to why the F-16 is so unstable on the ground and why it's very easy to tip the aircraft over when accidentally taxiing too fast. It also makes directional control on the runway when taking off in a crosswind much more difficult. This is one of the main reasons why the F-16 takes off without nose wheel steering turned on. So let's go ahead and give you guys a demonstration of how sensitive the F-16 is to crosswind. We should depart the runway and crash into something a lot earlier than the F-18 did. So we'll go ahead and open the controls indicator, and you guys can see we have 0 crosswind correction, and we're not going to do a static takeoff. Make everything as bad as possible. Woo, look at that. Coming off the runway already, might even hit that taxiway sign. The jet's going to tip over, and we're going to go across the runway here and eject. Boom. Not good at all. Another Class A mishap. But this can be prevented quite easily, just like the F-18C has crosswind takeoff techniques. So let's go ahead and reset the mission and hop back into our F-16 and talk about the crosswind takeoff technique in this aircraft. Okay guys, now that we've seen just how sensitive the F-16 is to crosswinds on takeoff, let's talk about the technique that you can use in order to safely take off in these conditions to perform the mission that you've been assigned. We'll open up the controls indicator as usual, and we're of course going to go full aileron deflection into the wind for our right to left crosswind today. Now in the F-16 we don't take off with nose wheel steering turned on, so we can deflect our rudders a bit, so that way the rudders are already in position to help us maintain directional stability on the runway when our rudder becomes aerodynamically effective. Now before we actually get to that point, we need to use our brakes and tap our brakes nice and gently with little taps in order to maintain directional control before that rudder becomes effective. So there's a lot more going on this takeoff in the F-16 than the F-18, and she's definitely a lot more squirrely, so don't think that you can have perfect, amazing results, especially in DCS, where we can't feel the acceleration and forces left, right, up, down, X, Y, Z axis, whatever you want to call it or describe it as, in a simulator with a flat screen or even with VR goggles. It's very, very difficult. So don't expect perfect results, but the goal in DCS is to get off the runway safely without crashing. So let's go ahead and get started. Of course, we're going to be using a static takeoff technique in the F-16, just like the F-18, so we can have full engine power and get up to speed as quickly as possible. Release brakes. Gentle taps on the brakes. There's our rudder becoming effective. We're going to start a gentle rotation. And we're going to gently rotate off the runway. We can see that right wing dip, that's what we want. And we'll start to let the jet crab into the wind as we get up above the runway and up to a safe altitude. We'll pull the jet out of burners, and we'll go along our normal climb to the en route and cruise structure as assigned by ATC. And we can see that the F-16 with that same crosswind will crab a lot more because the jet is weather vaning, because that wind is just grabbing that big old vertical stabilizer. And it just affects us so much more because our jet is smaller and lighter, but with a bigger vertical stabilizer surface than the F-18. So as you guys can see, it's definitely possible to take off in the same conditions in the F-16. It's probably just not going to be quite as pretty, but it can definitely be done, and you can definitely survive it and then be able to perform your mission as fragged. So let's go ahead and switch over to the F-14 and take a different look at crosswind takeoff techniques, because the F-14 is an entirely different animal from the F-18 and F-16. Alrighty guys, here we are in the cockpit of our F-14A Tomcat at Bandar Abbas Airfield. We've got that same direct 15-knot crosswind that we had down at Abu Dhabi in the F-16 and F-18. We can of course prove that by opening up the mission editor generated mission briefing, and we can see 124 degrees. And if we look down at our HSD and our F-14, we can see there's 120 degrees right there. So it's basically more or less a perfectly direct crosswind with no headwind component to it at all. Now the F-14 is a very different beast when it comes to crosswind correction on takeoff than it is in the F-16 and F-A-18. There's a few things we have going for us that help us in the F-14 as compared to, say, the F-16 like we talked about earlier. The surface area of the vertical stab is a lot lower compared to the overall area of the side of our aircraft. So the weather vaning effect is not nearly as strong in the F-14, as well as we have a gigantic wheelbase between our two main wheels in the F-14. This really contributes to awesome directional stability for the aircraft as we're racing down the runway. Now the F-14 also has something going for it that makes the crosswind correction in the F-14 extremely different from what we have available to us and what we need to do in the cockpit of our F-16 and F-A-18. Now, of course, we also want to make sure that we have both our spoiler and anti-skid armed in case we have to abort this takeoff for any reason. It's actually the spoilers that allow us to have immense directional control capabilities on the ground for both takeoff and landing, and of course for correcting for a crosswind. Now, in the F-A-18 and F-16, we roll into the crosswind. For a right to left crosswind, that would be rolling to the right. For a left to right crosswind, that would of course be rolling to the left. However, in the F-14, we do the opposite. We roll with the crosswind. So for our right to left crosswind we're dealing with today, we're going to be rolling to the left as we roll down the runway. Now this is very different from what you would do in the F-16 and F-A-18 and kind of goes against everything that we've been taught learning to fly in DCS World or in real life. However, what the F-14 has going for it that allows this control scheme to work really well is the spoiler system in the F-14 that augments your roll control at low airspeeds and with the wings swept forward. When we have the jet rolling down the runway and we have a right to left crosswind and we're rolling to the left, we can see the spoiler on the right hand side goes down while the spoiler on the left hand side remains up. This helps to negate the weather vaning effect by adding a ton of drag on the left hand side of the aircraft, pulling that nose back to the left as the weather vane is trying to pull the nose to the right. Keep in mind, guys, that if the crosswind was the opposite effect would be true. So keep that in mind. With the F-14 at a high power setting and a higher airspeed than just sitting stationary on the ground, we'll also have more spoilers pop up on the wings to augment that drag on the left-hand side of the aircraft and keep us directionally stable going down the runway. So let's go ahead and demonstrate once again the weather vaning effect as it affects the F-14. You should see that it should be somewhere closer to the F-A-18's weather vaning effect and nowhere near as strong or violent as the effect in the F-16. So here we go with no wind correction whatsoever. Wind is grabbing the right-hand side of our vertical stabs, pulling our nose to the right, weather vaning us into the wind, and boom, right off the runway. And there's another Class A mishap. Perfect. And Iran loses one of their very precious F-14s. But anyway, guys, as you can see, going down the runway there is not nearly as violent as it is when you are in the F-16. It doesn't pull you nearly as hard to that right-hand side, which is fantastic. And that's thanks to those smaller vertical stabs and that very wide wheelbase in the F-14. So let's hop back into the jet. And we will open up the controls indicator. We'll get ourselves all set up to take off. Make sure that our wings are in auto. Alright, so we got that same right to left crosswind here. So we're actually going to apply that left roll for the crosswind for our takeoff roll in the F-14. So here we go, guys. Let's go ahead and get to it. We're going to perform a static takeoff, of course, for the crosswind. And let's pause it real quick. You can see Just as I explained earlier, at a high power setting, more of those spoilers pop out on that left-hand side, adding even more drag to the left-hand side of the aircraft, negating some of that weather veining effect, pulling the nose to the right-hand side, and thus making the aircraft going down the runway pretty darn stable. Almost to the point where we have to let up on some of that crosswind correction to keep the airplane on centerline. As you can see me kind of feathering what I'm doing with the stick there. And then we're going to start gently rotating. And we'll just let the jet start to crab into the wind. And you can see that crab is keeping us right over the center line of our runway as we start to climb up out of the airport environment. So crosswind correction in the F-14 is probably the easiest out of all of the aircraft in DCS World, but it's also the least intuitive, which makes it more difficult. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something from this video. And if you would like me to delve deep into the crosswind landing techniques of the 3 aircraft that we've covered in this video today, let me know in the comment section down below, and we will definitely put that in the queue of videos to be made. Thanks a lot, guys. Please like and subscribe as always, and we'll see you in the next one. Fly safe out there and stay healthy, of course.